Well, let's get more on this now with David Marples. He's a professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Good to have you back with us, Professor. The attack on the apartment block in Dnipro has intensified calls for more advanced weapons for Ukraine. We know that Ukrainian troops, as we speak, have arrived in the US for training on the US Patriot missile defense system that's been promised by Washington. Can such weapons prevent tragedies such as the one we've seen in Dnipro?
In theory, they could certainly reduce them. Certainly, the weapons such as the Patriot would go a long way, I think, to intercepting missiles that are launched up to maybe 100, 150 miles from the target. There are also already in Ukraine significant weapons such as National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missiles, the so-called NASAMS. The UK has also sent the Starstreak air defense system. So you would think gradually that incidents like the one in Dnipro would be decreasing, although that's not to say they could be eliminated altogether simply because of the numbers of them taking place.
And let's talk about Belarus now, because that was one of the only countries that has supported Russia without question throughout this conflict. Ahead of Moscow's invasion, Belarus was used as a staging ground for Russian troops ahead of the conflict. Now there are growing fears that perhaps Belarus will have a more direct role in the Ukraine war. Is that a real possibility, do you think?
It's a possibility, but I would have to say it's unlikely as long as Lukashenko remains in power. He's been under great pressure for the last 2.5 years now, since the elections of 2020, when there were mass demonstrations trying to remove him. They failed. He's cracked down on the population. There are severe repressions. But he realizes that about 90% of the population opposes Belarusian troops taking part in a war in Ukraine. And he perhaps would think that his situation may be weakened if he sends troops. There's also a factor that there's about 1,000 Belarusian troops fighting in the Kalinovsky division on the Ukrainian side against the Russians already in place in Ukraine. So Belarusians have shown very ambivalent attitudes towards the war. And although technically these two are allies, there's a significant gap between what the regime wants and what the general population wants in Belarus. So that's why I think it's unlikely there would be a Belarusian invasion involving their soldiers at this time.
We know the United States by far has been the biggest supporter of the conflict in Ukraine in terms of providing military aid and weapons to Kiev, but we are seeing countries like Germany, the UK and even Poland step up now. Do the NATO allies, do they need to step up their support in terms of materiel for the conflict at this point?
Well, I think if I was President Zelensky, I would say yes, because he's constantly asking for more weapons and he wants them from wherever he can get them, especially from the NATO allies. And there's been a sort of mixed response. Some countries have sent a lot more than others, and the United States itself is probably responsible for 80 or 90% of the weapons going into Ukraine. So I think you could argue that more are needed. And I think Ukraine will be thinking of making a push and advance again in the spring when the situation is a little bit more stable on the ground, given the weather. At the moment, it's a war of attrition for one Donbass town or another. And the Russians are losing hundreds of troops in these attacks, almost fatalistic attacks, often involving mercenaries from the Wagner division or from Kadyrov and his Chechen group. And though they're losing a lot of men, they're gaining some ground. And as they gain ground, I think there's more a need for Ukraine to keep a constant supply of weapons on the war front. So I would say yes, but with qualifications. I don't think Ukraine needs too much more. I think they're doing fairly well in the war so far, in spite of the comment by Dmitry Peskov earlier in this broadcast.
Okay, Professor David Marples, we'll have to leave it there, but great to get your analysis as always. Thank you.